Hi, everybody. This is Nick Berbulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another in a series of interviews we're doing with authors of articles in the journal. Today, we have two guests, Nassim Noroozi and Rebecca Taylor, who have just guest edited a symposium for the journal on the theme of pedagogy and justice. It's a really interesting set of papers, very provocative, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with Nassim and Rebecca. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's start with this. One of the things that strikes me in the papers is the different conceptions of justice that are operating across the different papers, including some papers that are fairly critical of the notion of justice, certainly liberal conceptions of justice, even in some cases criticisms of some social justice work. So could you say a little bit about how these different notions of justice play across the different papers in the set?
Yeah. Do you want me to go, Rebecca, first, or you?
I mean, I can say maybe a little bit, and then do you want to jump in?
Sure.
So I think across the set, what I have noticed is there's some, like you said, there are some folks who are critiquing the way justice is used within liberal frameworks and even social justice conceptions. And then others who are, like in my paper with Caitlin Brust, we're looking at epistemic justice and how educators might be able to do work that helps advance justice. And then some other papers are thinking about how educators contribute to justice, and then others looking at the limitations of different conceptions. And those conceptions range from liberal conceptions of justice to more liberatory and transformative conceptions of justice. And then Nassim's piece is the kind of the most optimistic about the potential of pedagogy or the conception of the relationship between pedagogy and justice. And maybe Nassim can jump in there.
Yeah, thank you. Nassim?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I think going back to how we started the discussion on the theme would actually help. Rebecca and I were approached as members of the community on the status of women at the Philosophy of Educational Society, and we kind of looked at how we wanted to look at the broader concepts of injustice that will encompass women's issues as well. And I came up with this very weird idea of defining pedagogy in a very particular way so that it would be affiliated with philosophy. And since I kind of said arranging meanings in a way that it would be impossible to not see injustice anymore. So I kind of approached it from a very particular perspective that I think it wasn't neither liberal nor was previously discussed in the decolonial setting or the critiques of liberal theory before. And I think Rebecca did the amazing job of translating that into a more nuanced version, so that others can also chime in. So for that, I'm thankful to her. But to answer your question, Nick, I think one of the things that I really like with my experiences that I've had with my mentors in the liberal tradition or in the tradition of liberal philosophy is the capacity of liberal philosophy's critique of itself. And that this platform for this special issue provided the opportunity for the decolonial critiques that are often geared towards liberal philosophy to sort of showcase itself in so that we can see the pertinence of the critiques. So I kind of want to say that we used it to our advantage. We used this this capacity for self-critique to our advantage, and that's why I think the pieces, what we started communicating with each other and conversing with each other, but in very, very different ways or taking different directions.
Yeah, that's interesting. So some of the more decolonial papers actually take off also against certain conceptions of social justice as well, not only liberal conceptions of justice. I'm not sure I would classify social justice as a liberal conception. And I found some of those critiques somewhat surprising, since a lot of people talk about social justice pedagogy as a pretty central idea. At least from certain perspectives, that notion itself can be seen as pretty limited and problematic.
Yeah, coming from kind of the background of decolonial philosophy myself, I have my own critiques towards this continuous criticism of a tradition, because I sometimes find it kind of edging on armchair philosophizing that we were trying to avoid ourselves. So we've had a lot of back and forth with Catherine Walsh and Nelson Maldonado Torres on this very issue. And yes, I think it is one of the trendy issues in academia to actually criticize the established progressive discourses and then criticize the established responses to those progressive discourses and then continue on. So I think it speaks to the more broader structural problem of critique in philosophy or theories that aim to offer correctives to the current injustices than it really speaking to, I think, the liberal tradition itself. So that's how I frame this. I see this as a bigger structural discussion point.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do you have anything else to add, Rebecca?
I think that's yeah, I appreciate everything Nassim shared. I think, and I appreciated reading Nelson Maldonado Torres and his co-author's piece. That I thought it was helpful to see how they focus specifically on the ethnic studies requirements in the California State University system in kind of explicating that critique of the way approaches to social justice can be misaligned with their view of decolonial pedagogy and what that requires. So it was helpful for me to see it grounded in that example.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to pick up on a theme that Nassim just mentioned, this idea of engaged philosophy. I think one of the reasons for focusing on the notion of pedagogy across the papers, which are quite different in approach. I mean, some are decolonial, some are very, very different in their orientation. I like the multifaceted nature of this debate. But one of the things I think that does cut across the papers is this idea of pedagogy as a politically engaged activity. And perhaps from certain views, inevitably or necessarily a politically engaged activity. And I'm interested in your views on that, how you see that cutting across the paper. And then I have a follow-up question about that.
Nassim, do you want to jump in on that
one? Sure. I mean, I think the way we again approached the idea of pedagogy, I think, Nick, you were also surprised when we said, all right, this is what we think of pedagogy, and to arrange meanings in a way that it would be impossible to not see injustice anymore. Yes, and we didn't reference Freire or at least for my part, decolonial thinkers. I mean, I mentioned Fanon briefly in the call for papers, but I think the definition that we provided was in and of itself decolonial without necessarily relying on any particular decolonial notion. And when we are looking at decolonial works, we are engaging with colonialism, which is inherently a political issue. And so, in that sense, yes, I think from the get-go, we had this idea that we're not looking at pedagogical tools necessarily for teaching methods, but we're kind of like went right to the heart of the matter, which was transformative justice was the whole sole reason of pedagogy. And let me relate this directly back to the dangerous endeavors that Socrates did, and this is how we're going to relate this to philosophy. So then there's a responsibility for philosophy to be more political as well. So this is how we sort of created or traced back the idea of pedagogy, I think. Or maybe I kind of imposed this on Rebecca, and then Rebecca patiently sort of interpreted it in other ways so that other themes can be seen from it too.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, on that question, I don't know if I have a lot to add. I think that across the set, it was interesting to see. I think everyone's thinking in the various papers are thinking about pedagogy as oriented, either as something that can contribute to justice, on one of these different various conceptions of justice, or something more fundamental on their view and kind of beyond justice, if that's decolonialism or liberation. Although some, I think in Chrissy Hernandez and her co-author's paper, they think of justice and kind of as liberatory and transformative, and think about how pedagogy can contribute to that in a similar way that Nassim's paper does, but in a more kind of that paper is much more grounded in their teaching practices, and is one of the more kind of I guess empirically grounded in the teaching practice of the set of the papers.
Thank you for that. So I think all the papers are pretty explicitly set in a higher education context. And I'm interested in this idea of pedagogy as, among other things, a critique of the institutional context in which the pedagogy is taking place. And I'm interested in your views on that approach, what you see as some of the possibilities of that approach, what you see as some of the perhaps complications or difficulties of that approach.
I can jump in first on this one,
yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
My dog is making a lot of noises outside.
Okay. I mean, in my paper with Caitlin Brust, our approach to that question is we wanted to think about what can college educators do within the classroom in particular, and kind of seminar style classrooms. And we take a pretty qualified view. We think there's, as far as the role of or potential of pedagogy in transforming some of the injustices that arise in higher education context, we think pedagogy has a role to play, but a somewhat limited one. And in the paper, we point to the need for collective action to push for structural changes as well. But then in the paper, we try to focus on what, with like accepting the caveats about the limits there, what can be done in the classroom. And I think some of the other papers probably would endorse a similarly qualified view, and then others might have see more potential for pedagogy as transformative by itself.
Yep. Yes. Nassim?
Yeah, I agree with Rebecca. I kept thinking as I was reading Rebecca and Caitlin's paper, in that context, how would if they assign Nelson Maldonado Torres and his colleagues' paper to their students, and then they practice the methods that they talked about, what can come out of it? And I don't think that, I think that's a fabulous idea. And again, going back to the capacity for self-critique, I need to keep reminding myself and my students that is one of the reasons we are in academia itself, and that's one of the signs of intellectual growth. So I don't see criticism as something antithetical to what is being taught. I really see it as eventually a very dialectical, move towards something that is better. So with that being said, it's very interesting because I don't see a contrast, or a very stark contrast, between Rebecca and Caitlin's paper versus Nelson Maldonado's paper, because I'm sure that when they assign this to their class, interesting discussions will come up, and they'll follow through with the steps that they were suggesting to discuss Nelson's idea. And that's probably the beauty of academia. It's eventually a dialectical, I hope that it eventually is a dialectical movement towards better thinking and growth.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we don't have time to discuss all the papers in the set. You've touched on several of them already. But before we break, I did want you to go through and actually tell our readers, our viewers, all the papers and the authors in the set. There's a link here, and I encourage people to read the papers as a whole. It's a really interesting and, as I said, very provocative set of papers. Do you want to list the authors and titles first, please?
Yes, Rebecca, do you want to go ahead? You're awesome in this.
Sure. So we have Nassim Noroozi's paper on pedagogy as justice, and then a paper from Catherine Walsh that is titled On Justice, Pedagogy, and Decolonializing Praxis. And then a paper from Nelson Maldonado Torres and I think 5 co-authors, titled Decolonial Pedagogy Against the Coloniality of Justice. And then the last 2 in the set are a paper by Caitlin Brust and myself titled Resisting Epistemic Injustice, the Responsibilities of College Educators at Historically White Colleges and Universities. And then finally, a paper by Shiva Savadi, Chrissy Hernandez, and Ethan Chang titled Towards Pedagogical Justice, Teaching Worlds That We Can Collectively Build.
Outstanding. I think even the titles give us a pretty good idea of the direction of some of these papers. Thank you so much for putting this set of papers together. I'm looking forward to seeing it appear in the journal. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye-bye.